Hello, my name is Mark Greene, Mission Champion at the London Institute for Contemporary Christianity, and this is the TGIM Thank God It's Monday podcast, where we explore the way Jesus works through a whole variety of people in a whole variety of sectors and jobs. In this episode, we're going into the whirling world of hospital medicine. And joining us to offer astute diagnosis and splendid prescriptions are Ben Chang, 5 years qualified as a registrar now in A&E, high stakes, high jeopardy context, and also by John Wyatt, 500 years qualified, emeritus professor of neonatal pediatrics, treating babies, again in a high-stakes, high jeopardy context for us adrenaline junkies, I suspect, both of you.
Right.
Well, shalom, welcome to you both. As ever in the TGIM podcast, you get to interrupt, ask questions of one another, and so on. But I get to ask the first one. And I'm going to begin with you, Ben. Ben, what drew you into medicine in general and into A&E in particular?
Sure, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. My kind of journey into medicine as a field was somewhat unintentional. I didn't have this kind of desire since childhood to be a doctor or some sort of epiphany. I was 16, 17, trying to figure out what to do at university, kind of liked science. My parents really wanted me to be a doctor, and I didn't really know what else to do. So I applied for medicine, somehow managed to get into UCL, kind of just started not really knowing what I was doing. That being said, once I started, within a few months, I very quickly realized actually this was pretty amazing. This was an amazing thing to do, to be a part of, a real privilege to do, and I'm now very glad that I did. I do love medicine. I do love my job. I reserve the right to moan about it quite a lot, but I do love my job. A&E was a bit more intentional. I did.
It wasn't an accident.
That wasn't an accident.
Some of the jokes here is fantastic.
I was warming up. So I in my first 2 years of doctoring, you have to do various rotations, and A&E was one of them. And I just found myself very at home in A&E. I love the chaos and the drama and the diversity of things that you get to do, the pace at which. I found myself taking to it as my natural habitat. And then, applied for A&E specialist training, and now about halfway through my specialist training in emergency medicine.
I get the variety bit, the sort of the diversity bit, but I was in an A&E department about 3 weeks ago, and I got to say, it doesn't look, to the outside, doesn't look like a great place. So it's incredibly noisy. Mm-hmm. There are all kinds of people there. There are elderly people there with people looking after them who don't know where they are. There's a guy there sitting there with blood literally running down the side of his face. There's a woman there who's clearly unwell with 3 children because there's clearly no one else to look after the children, and she's brought them along with her. I mean, it's just going on and on. There's people coming in, calling out people's names that they can't pronounce, and no one knows who's been called out, and so on and so forth.
And someone's in the toilet, and someone's gone for a bag.
Yeah, exactly. You go into the corridor, it's completely rammed. I get variety, but that, you have to explain a little bit more about why that's attractive. It's like a Middle Eastern bazaar on a bad day.
And don't get me wrong, it is stressful, and certainly when it is rammed. I mean, a lot of A&E at the moment have corridors that are rammed with patients who really should be in the department or in the hospital, and it's just kind of loads and loads and queues of people sitting on the floor or lying or sitting on chairs when they should be in beds, and that's not pleasant. That is not pleasant to watch, and also for us it feels like we're not giving the care we should be simply because there is no space, there's no resources. So it is hard. But at the same time, I like the kind of drama of it. As I mean, you say adrenaline junkie. I probably am a bit of an adrenaline junkie for that. But also on a kind of more sober front, in those situations where it is so chaotic and so challenging, actually small things can make a big difference. like taking a moment to say hello to someone, to have a conversation with them, to get them a cup of tea can make a big difference, because it's so unpleasant to be sat in a corridor floor in A&E for 5-6 hours. So yes, it is challenging for patients and for staff, but the opportunities are great as well.
It's often obvious to people on the outside that, of course, if you're in medicine, if you're a nurse, if you're a doctor, of course, this is a good thing to be doing. You're in the healing professions. But one of the things I discovered in working with the Christian Medical Fellowship is that often actually medical professionals don't particularly think that they're at all special, and that actually if you'd really got your act together properly, then the Lord would have called you to be a pastor. And I remember talking to one guy who was a doctor, said, I got quite annoyed, said I got sort of annoyed with God. If you haven't made me a pastor, the least you can do is send me overseas as a medical missionary. How do you think about your work, if you like, theologically, biblically? What underpins it from that point of view?
Wow, that's a big question. I'd also like to hear John's answer to this question.
I think you'd be able to stop it.
But I can start as an intro. I mean, there's a lot that can be said about this. And certainly I've heard it said from some pulpits that, or at least implied that, if you're really godly and really committed to Christ, then you become a vicar and maybe a missionary, that can also count, or an evangelist. And, if you are kind of less committed to Jesus, then you can do one of these other secular professions, of which medicine would be one. And I would respectfully disagree with that for a whole host of reasons. I think for a start, the Bible speaks of us as integrated whole people who are physical, who are psychological, who are relational, and who are spiritual beings. And we should care for people, as whole individuals. And therefore, the idea that, the important stuff is the spiritual stuff, and that, if you really cared for someone, or if you really cared about Jesus, you would care about their spiritual health. And the medical stuff, the physical stuff, that can take second priority. It's a very bizarre way of seeing whole human beings, just in a human level, never mind theologically. Mm-hmm. And one of the privileges of being a medic is that I get to do a little bit of the different aspects and to try my best to care for whole people as whole people. And that is both in the workplace and in the church. And then I think also is worth perhaps mentioning that when Jesus is asked about the greatest commandment, it's love God, love your neighbor, and then is asked, well, who is my neighbor? And he tells the story of the Good Samaritan. This parable of really self-sacrificial, physical, gritty, expensive love.
Very good.
And there's no evangelism involved. It's pure physical care for their physical needs. That is what Jesus describes when asked about love God and love your neighbor. And so I'm not saying that it's not loving to evangelize and to tell people the gospel, but clearly Jesus has a much bigger view of love than just that. Yeah. And the wonderful thing about the Good Samaritan is that all the kind of hallmarks of love that Jesus describes, meeting them at the point of need, free of charge, and doing whatever it takes, caring for their for their physical needs, crossing barriers, cultural barriers. That a lot of that stuff is written into the job description of doctors, that we're meant to do that professionally. We have to do that, and that's a real privilege to do.
You now own the Good Samaritan parable for yourselves. Fantastic. I noticed that it gets a very good private room in that particular parable. I'm looking forward to that. John, you were invited to comment on theological, biblical foundations for your work.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Ben. I thought that was great. And, I very much agree with it. I was very influenced by John Stott, who was a spiritual father to me. He was rector of All Souls. I was a young medical student. And one of the constant themes he came upon was the concept of incarnational mission. And in particular, he talked about we all know the Great Commission in Matthew chapter 28, go into the world and make disciples. But there's a second Great Commission, which is the one in Gospel of John, as the Father has sent me, I am sending you. And that idea that how did God the Father send Jesus into the world? He sent him as a carer, as somebody who was going to live out God's love in practice. And now Jesus is saying to his disciples, as the Father has sent me, just in the same way, now I'm sending you. So that vision of whole life, incarnational ministry, that I was called to be Jesus, So the question was, I can remember thinking this, if instead of coming as a carpenter into, first century Palestine, God had chosen to break into the world as a very tired junior doctor working in central London in a very demanding kind of intensive medicine, what would he have been like? How would he have worked? How would he have treated the patients? How would he have treated the babies? And then my calling is to try to be Jesus in that situation.
It reminds me, actually, and I've got this prayer that I try to pray before shifts, and I have no idea where it came from, and I don't know if it came from you or not, so you can take credit for it if you want. But it's a prayer that I find very helpful, which is, as I go into shift, God, help me see you and be you today in the shift. So help me see you, see the image of God in each patient I have, that they're not a problem list or the diagnosis solved, they're an image bearer of God, and then to be you, to be your hands, to administer your love to these patients. And I found that has helped me at least kind of frame what I do each day. I don't know if I got that from you or not.
Well, it said plagiarism is the greatest Christian virtue. So I did say that, but I pinched it from other people. Okay. So, I encourage you to pinch the good stuff and repeat it.
It's a bit of a pity I was going to take credit for it myself. Before we go on too far, John, tell us about your own, if you can remember this far back, how you began and what drew you into medicine.
Yeah, well, I was going to be a scientist. I was going to be a cosmologist. Actually, I loved physics. I was going to investigate the mysteries of the universe, and this was sort of age 17, 18, and my idea was I was going to live in a laboratory and think deep thoughts about the universe. And once every 5 years, I'd come out and make sure the world was still there. But actually, that was it, And even that kind of lifestyle seemed attractive at the time. I thought, how wonderful to live in a lab, And then when I actually went to physics, I went to university and read physics. And then it was really my first year at university. I had this kind of life crisis, which was very much related to, what are you here for? Is Christianity really reliable? I came from a Christian home, but I had all kinds of questions and doubts. And did I really believe this? Had I been brainwashed by my parents? And really, it was in my first year of university that my Christian faith came alive. I suddenly discovered the reality of Jesus as a living person and the Holy Spirit in my life. And then, to my utter astonishment, within weeks of a really quite dramatic experience, I suddenly had this strong sense I was being called to be a doctor. And I suppose I rationalized it by saying, well, medicine is a way of using the science I'm good at for the people that God really cares about. And so that meant I had to leave the university where I was because I didn't do, for various technical reasons. I came to London.
I think it'd be slightly modest. I think you were at Oxford.
I was at Oxford.
Not many people go, I'm leaving Oxford. What a good idea.
Yeah. And so I came to the grime of London and left the dreaming spires. And then I thought, what am I doing? It was South London. It was Lambeth. It was Lambeth. I started at St Thomas's Hospital Medical School, as it was then.
Right.
And it was a big transition. But in retrospect, I can see God's hand leading and going before it. And I've basically loved it. I mean, medicine is I was just made to be a baby doctor.
Yeah, but how did you get into that? How did you get into baby?
Again, I sort of discovered I was an adrenaline junkie, and I loved intensive care. I loved the drama and the life and death stuff. And I did adult intensive care for some time. I worked in adult medicine. And then, basically at that time, I was planning to be a missionary. I felt God was calling me to be a missionary doctor. I was going to give my life gloriously for the Lord, probably in Africa, and probably be martyred at a young age. And but in order to do that, I did have all these very romantic ideas. But anyway, in order to do that,
it's not over 7.
But I had pediatrics would be a good thing to study, and so I decided to do a year of pediatrics before being a missionary and going abroad. And I suddenly, when I started pediatrics, it felt like I'd come home. There was just something about. I can remember the first ward round with a consultant pediatrician, and I was just the junior guy just starting. And as we were going around in this chaos of the children's ward, and then the consultant gets down on his hands and knees and starts playing with the toys. Oh, this is a really good one. How do you want to go with this? I just thought, this is me. I like this. This is much better than those sort of, the problem in adult medicine, particularly academic medicine, because I worked at Bart's and there you had these huge egos, these academic medical egos, that they had such arrogance, and it was quite painful. So by and large, pediatricians don't have an exaggerated sense of their own importance. If you're really confident about, your status is really important to you, the number of letters after your name and the fact that you've got this, that said. Well, children are not terribly impressed by this. They take you as they find you, and so people who have a very exaggerated sense of importance don't go to pediatrics. They do neurosurgery or cardiology.
I think we all have a sense, I suppose, having been to A&E at some point, of what that feels like, looks like, however naive I might be about it. But I'm not sure we have a sense of intensive care and babies. And can you just give us a not too gory picture of that?
Yeah, well, it's an extraordinary environment. And I can remember the first time walking into the neonatal intensive care unit at UCH, where I ended up spending most of my career. And it was just an extraordinary kind of otherworld existence, because very focused in a relatively small area, you've got a huge amount of equipment, very sophisticated equipment. You've got some very, very sick babies, some of them incredibly tiny, literally the size of my hand, 500 grams, surrounded by machinery. You've got incubators, you've got intense lights sometimes, and you've got a kind of team working together. There's a great sense of camaraderie within the team. We're all in this together. Someone described this as a bit like being in a submarine. We're locked into the submarine. The most important thing in a submarine is that you want the kind of colleague who doesn't go flaky when the depth charges start coming down. And it's a bit like the same thing. You're in this quite intense environment. But I loved the teamwork. I loved being part of a multidisciplinary team, because we work very closely with neonatal nurses, with physiotherapists, with medical physicists, speech and language therapists, believe it or not, working with babies. And being part of that team, working together, supporting one another, saying, oh, you've got an emergency, shall I come and give you a hand? But also the touchy-feely aspect with the babies. So there's part of it is a very technical, quite sophisticated, lots of physics, which I loved, the science of it all. And then there's this very touchy-feely. Here are grieving parents, agonizing, watching their precious baby. Maybe, we've got to give them bad news. The scan has shown bleeding in the brain. We don't know, this could mean your baby's going to have some kind of brain damage, possibly cerebral palsy. How do we break the bad news? How do we support the parents through this experience? So it's a fascinating combination. And I just love those two things, hard science, and at the same time, a kind of touchy-feely empathy.
And within the hard science and the touchy-feely empathy, do you see God operating in that? How does your relationship with God feed into those contexts?
Well, I do. And the extraordinary thing is that, not always, of course, and there are terrible things sometimes, and inexplicable evil. And yet, sometimes I can think of occasions when the neonatal unit where I was working felt a holy place. It felt in some ways more holy than the church down the road. It felt as though the presence of God in an intangible, non-verbal way. Here was love. Here was the preciousness of life. here was a miracle happening in front of our eyes. Sometimes a tragic thing, a baby dying, but a sense of God's presence, a sense of love, a sense of awe at what's going on here. You know, I've sometimes wished that I was a great creative artist, because I would love to capture the expression of a parent as they carry a dying baby in their arms. It's sort of amazing love and amazing, almost awe and wonder at what they're seeing, and also sadness, you know, all mingled together.
And how have you been able to stand alongside people?
Well, it's just the privilege again, you know, I mean, as Ben said, it's about trying to be Jesus in this situation, and trying to be the hands of Jesus. You know, one of the extraordinary privileges of medicine is that we are allowed to actually be the hands. We can touch people. We can mediate God's love in physical contact. And, you know, I could easily have ended up as a preacher or a theologian or so on, but the problem with that is that in the end, all you do is you talk. You talk a lot. But as medics, some people talk a great deal, actually, Mark. But in
today, I'd like to point out.
But in medicine, yes, we have the opportunity to talk, but actually, a lot of what we do is non-verbal. It's just being the hands. And so, I try to be Jesus. I'm praying, Lord, help me to be. So, and I've learned that actually I don't have to talk. A lot of the time, I just have to be there, and by my presence, and by and sometimes praying silently, just being there for the other people, I can, in a very limited way, try to be Jesus in the situation. But also, we call to see Jesus, and it meant a lot to me that the story of the incarnation, you know. How would Mary and Joseph have treated that little bundle that they had in Bethlehem? Would they have said, "Oh, it's just a baby"? I mean, for goodness sake, change the nappy, get on, next one, please. They wouldn't. They would. You know, can you imagine the kind of what it was like to carry the Son of God in your arms and to change his nappy and to birth him when he's got a pain in his tummy and a mixture of love and respect. And so I was called to treat this little baby with that same kind of awe and respect and love and tenderness that Mary and Joseph would have treated theirs.
Mm.
Yeah, I've heard John speak about this before, and it really came home to me, this idea of being the hands of Jesus during the pandemic. So I worked in A&E right throughout from the very beginning of COVID. And certainly initially, the thing that was hardest for me was that there were no relatives. We banned everyone coming into the hospital, and for obvious infection control reasons. And a few months later, we did sort of really relax the rules a bit when it came to relatives, particularly of patients who were dying. But certainly when it came to the initial few months, you had bays and bays and bays of people dying of COVID alone. Completely alone, with no one around that they knew or loved. And that came home to me, this idea that actually, yes, I can do the scans and give the drugs and prescribe things and make the diagnoses. And at that time, there was only really one diagnosis to make, so it wasn't that hard. But actually, the thing that these guys wanted and desperately wanted, especially the ones who were dying, were human presence, a human hand to touch, someone to spend just an extra minute or two with them. Being kind of another human in the room. And it was an incredibly kind of dramatic example of how important this can be. That yes, I often get carried away sometimes with the kind of seeing the next patient and trying to figure out this difficult diagnosis or doing these procedures and stuff. And actually, a lot of what we do, a lot of the one of the most important things we do as medics and in the health service is just being with people, holding hands and being that other human in the room.
Certainly for me, when my father died very early on in the pandemic, and he didn't go through the what you might call the desperate measures that might have been taken with the breathing, and I was called nearly at midnight, and a nurse I talked to the nurse who'd been with him. Her name was Rachel. I don't know her second name. And it was incredibly, it was an awful moment, but it was incredibly affirming that she said, I was with him the whole time. And, to know that there was somebody there. And there was a great tenderness in her voice, which I was hearing. And so I think that is something that good doctors and good nurses do, don't they? They're there. They're there for people.
And particularly as people approach death, the greatest fear is abandonment. The greatest fear for so many people is that I'm just going to be left to cope with this terrible, unbelievable situation alone. And so to be able to say, we're here for you, we're going to walk alongside you, and we're going to covenant that we'll never leave you, we're going to walk with you to the end. I think that's a really important expression of that.
And also I particularly appreciated it because, you were busy. There were other people to look after, so it made a big difference. John, in terms of, if you like, for want of a better term, spiritual practice, without wanting to disintegrate the human being in any way, what have you learned along the way of how to go about, if you like, connecting with God?
Yeah, well, it's been a long, slow process of learning and making mistakes and learning again and relearning and so on. But I think one of the things I've learned is that it was really important for me to try to prepare myself before I hit the intensive care unit, even if it was only a short time, a time of sort of just focusing, specifically praying for what was coming this day, thinking about what events might be happening, praying for some of the people I was going to meet, and just praying that God would be with me and give me opportunities to be a witness to in whatever way He wanted. And I can particularly remember when I was working as a junior in the intensive care unit, the song "Make Me a Channel of Thy Peace" was very significant to me. I used to sing that. I tried to sing that to myself, just internally. Make me a channel of your peace where there's despair in life. Let me bring hope where there's darkness, only light. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned, in giving to all men that we receive, and in dying that we're born to eternal life. That was just helped me to, because as soon as you hit the ward, it's like things are happening, people are. But trying to prepare, I think, with that preparation beforehand was really important. And then I'd been very moved and influenced by this concept of practicing the presence of Christ. I'd read Brother Lawrence, who worked. He wasn't even a monk. He was just a kind of assistant in the
kitchen.
In the kitchens, he was, and he talked about doing the washing up and practicing the presence of Christ. And I was very influenced by that idea that wherever you're doing, it was possible to practice God's presence. It was to have a kind of an awareness of His presence. And so I really tried to do that. I'd come across this definition of the Christian life as a combination of praying and living. That's basically what we're called to do. And so how could I do that? How is it possible to pray without ceasing as I was actually working? And of course, many, many times I failed, and I would come to the end of the day and it would suddenly cross my mind. I hadn't once thought about anything spiritual at all. I'd just been totally preoccupied. But there were other days where I was just aware of God's presence as I was going through. And one helpful thing was the idea of putting in reminders. As I went through my day, I tried to put in things that I knew I was going to have to do and that would be a kind of reminder of God's presence. So one of the things I remember as a junior doctor was when we worked in the intensive care unit, one of the things you had to do was you had to take a blood sample from a baby, go to the lab just along the corridor and squirt the sample into a clever machine, blood gas machine, analyzer, and you would then wait about 20 to 30 seconds, then it would print out, and print out the result. So I tried to just make it a discipline that I would use those 30 seconds to pray for the baby, to pray for the parents, to pray for myself. And it was just those kind of little reminders that just bring it back into, oh yeah, I remember now, I'm supposed to pray.
It sounds like blood gas machines have not changed in about 30 years. This is exactly the same now.
Yeah.
So that pray continually. I mean, so can you Can you examine someone's abdomen and be praying?
Yes, it's actually a skill you can learn. To my amazement, it is perfectly possible to, while you are taking a history, talking to people, examining an abdomen, listening to chest, doing a scan, at another level, you can be praying, and often without words, just aware of the presence of God. And I think it is a skill. I think the more we practice this, the more we can integrate it into our lifestyle, and therefore, and particularly then when I'm with somebody who's very distressed, somebody who is, Lord, just help me help me to hear what's going on here. Give me wisdom. What words should I use here? And over the years, I've learned to sort of go with the flow, so that if something, as I'm doing this, and something just pops into my mind, I just go with the flow. Sometimes it's a verse, or it's a sort of saying, or something I heard. But if it seems to be helpful, I will just say something like, I don't know why, but this is just going through my mind, so I'll just say it to you. And sometimes I can say, gosh, I can't believe you just said that. So, the God can use these unexpected things that go through our head.
I remember meeting a woman who's sort of the head nurse in an emergency unit, and they got the call that somebody was coming in with a woman with half her arm off by helicopter. So they come in, and apparently when somebody comes in, you would definitely know this, when you're asking them questions, when, they tend to be quite focused on listening to you and responding to you. And she was thinking, this woman seems to be preoccupied about something. So the nurse, what is going on here? This is really unusual. Why she seems not quite to be quite present with me, and I would expect. And the Lord said to her, well, ask her. And so she asked her, so is there something else going on for you at the moment, apart from the fact that your arm is new? And the woman said, well, yes, I'm worried about my dogs. Who's going to feed my dogs?
It's always the dogs.
It's
always the dogs and the cats, yeah.
And I thought, oh, my goodness. So don't worry, we'll get somebody to the dogs. We'll do something like that. And that was it. She asked God, ask her. And that was... How about you, Ben? Here you are. So we can also ask this question in two ways. One, how do you sustain yourself? It's obviously emotionally, spiritually, physically demanding, and often all of those things. How do you sustain yourself? And I'm quite interested in what you say as a manager to people. How do you help people maintain their perspective? They're younger doctors than you, but take those questions in whatever order you like. I'm sorry, it's very unprofessional to ask two questions at once.
I mean, I concur with a lot of what John said, and I find it very helpful.
I'm glad to hear it. I suppose jolly well help you do concur.
I'll ask you for an endorsement in a year.
Yes, quite. I'll give you a reference.
Thank you. That could be quite useful. I think it's certainly the kind of the spiritual aspects of the day-to-day work is something I find challenging. I mean, it's hard to keep praying, to keep kind of cognizant of God when, the wait time is 8 hours, everyone's shouting at me, someone's got their arm, half off, whatever. I do think also, to go back to our integrative model of the human being, that I don't know if you'd agree, but I think medics are generally quite bad at looking after themselves, both psychologically and physically. And even very simple things like taking breaks, like eating and drinking water, having time to just mend yourself, and also psychologically having things that can be done to switch off and to take your mind off work. I mean, we're very bad at that, and that I think is a discipline as well. And for our own sake, so that we can continue doing what we're doing. I think also that it is a godly thing. That we look after the bodies that God has given us, that they are God's, that we have, that He has bestowed on us, and we should take care of them and not break them. And certainly, I try to, in small ways, encourage my colleagues to do the same. I don't know. There's a book that you might like called "Fruitfulness on the Front Line." I don't know if you know it. It's a very. I find this really helpful, actually, what you write in "Fruitfulness on the Front Line" about kind of modeling godly character and ministering loving grace.
Yeah, very good.
And kind of these small acts that actually can make a big difference, such as asking junior colleagues, have you had a break? Do you want to go
the interesting thing is, as you get more senior as a doctor, you have more and more opportunities of doing that, and it's so unusual because, unfortunately, a lot of senior doctors are really insensitive, bullying, abusive, contemptuous sometimes of the juniors. And so to actually, as a senior doctor, try to be genuinely concerned about their welfare and saying, look, you've been working very hard, I'll carry your pager, you go off and have half an hour and break, and I think just taking that kind of role, the small acts of compassion and care is really very significant, and people notice because it's unusual.
Yeah, or doing a coffee run.
Exactly, yeah.
Sweet.
It's interesting, the research was done a little while back by a senior nurse, and concluding that the NHS was actually the rudest large organisation to work in, which was interesting again.
It is, and I mean, a little tidbit too, and that is the government set up a hotline for bullying at work, and it turned out that although the NHS comprised something like 7% of the workforce, 20% of the calls to the bullying at work or something like that were from NHS staff. So it just shows you that unfortunately, as an organisation, it's often deeply broken in terms of its practices.
What do you think that is?
Well, I think it's often what staff find is that they are in this double bind. They've got two kinds of pressures. On the one hand, you've got senior management saying, no, we're not getting enough throughput, you've got to do more with less, we're cutting down this, you've got to work harder, we're not satisfied. So there's all this pressure coming from the top. And at the same time, you've got all this pressure coming from patients who say, do you know how long I've been working at this? It's ridiculous. And so there's a kind of pushback and hostility from patients. So the staff in the middle are just feeling very abused. And it's not surprising that this comes out often in bad relationships, and in people pushing back, and it's so it just shows you, doesn't it? Although the calling of the NHS, to be there for people is fundamentally a very godly calling. Some very ungodly and bad things can happen within the staffing structures.
Yeah, no, I'd agree, and that's certainly been my experience over the few years I've been working. I mean, I don't know if we can go on to this about kind of how we deal with that. I don't know if that's where you want to go.
Yeah, no.
I was actually, so Mark told us, has told me, I don't know if he told you, that we were asking questions to each other.
Yeah.
And so I took it upon myself to send a message out to the Christian Medical Fellowship Junior Doctors WhatsApp groups, asking, I'm on air on a podcast with John Wyatt, and I'm told to ask him some questions. Any ideas? And I got a barrage of messages, loads of different questions.
Where does he get his hair cut?
Someone
Why is he such a plonker?
Someone asked me to ask you if you had any resolution to the Israel-Palestine conflict, but I won't go in there. That's another podcast. But one of the kind of fairly common themes was actually how to deal with conflict in the workplace, and I certainly think for me that's one of the most stressful parts of my job. Like, I actually usually don't get that stressed about medical emergencies, but whether it be conflict between doctors or doctors' nurses or doctors' managers or doctors' patients or relatives, there's a lot of conflict and fighting and backstabbing and slander that goes on. Do you have any wisdom on how to deal with that?
Well, yeah, it's absolutely true. And I think, a few things I would say. Number one, I think a huge amount of damage is done by email and by social media. And I think there's some really important messages about the use of email and social media and texts and so on. And that is basically, I don't think you should ever put something negative into an email or into a text. I think these things are very good for positive things. So fantastic news, well done, isn't that amazing? Blah blah. Or for just things, why don't we meet at 3:30 on Thursday? Things that are emotionally neutral. But I've seen so much damage done by negative emails. Somebody who just, I'm very disappointed. And of course, you don't know when the other person's going to pick up that email. Something terrible may have happened. You've just had a terrible day. At last, you get back to your office and you open up and that's the first thing that comes bang, and so I think if you've got something negative to say, the best way to do it is face to face. And so look, this is really important. Can we, we need to meet in the next, before tomorrow. How can we do it? Meet people face to face. If you can't do that, then a phone call at least. But I think that it just seems to me that the evil one uses this kind of frustrated, negative emails. And of course, then the other thing you can do is copy and paste. And do you know what he said to me? And blah, blah, blah. I'll just copy it to all my friends. The whole thing just escalates. So I think that's one thing. And I think the other thing is I think being a peacemaker is more positive than just being a kind of a compromiser, someone who it's actually a peace creator. It's about how can I create a better environment here, and I think it's often just getting people together. I think the kind of just building friendships, honest, open, intimate friendships, not taking part in the gossip, pushing back. If somebody's being attacked by other people, sometimes it's taking their side and saying, well, actually, trying to be different. And I think there's such a lot of bad morale in the NHS, and people just love it, particularly with junior doctors. The seniors just love saying, oh, I wouldn't, if I was you, I'd get out, go and be a lawyer. This is hopeless. Medicine, it's a disaster, complete disaster, waste of time. I hate being a doctor. They're just putting all this kind of negative vibes. And just to be positive and enthusiastic and say, actually, it's a great job, and isn't it wonderful to be here? And, just pushing back against this negativity. People much prefer to be around positive people. They much prefer to be around something. And affirming, again, as a senior doctor, one of the best things, the most important things you do is just to encourage. You did a really good job there. I thought the way you handled that situation was very good, giving specific positive feedback. Again, just makes a huge difference. You can just see people blossoming when they're encouraged and affirmed. And
positive people stand out in the NHS. They're that infrequent. And people who just exude positivity and encouragement. And people notice them.
I know you do a number of things, in your own context. I mean, A&E is a slightly different dynamic. How do you go about being a positive presence?
Oh, I mean, much the same, I think. I mean, trying to be positive and affirming, and trying to not get involved in the gossip and slander is quite a big thing. Like, there's a huge slanderous kind of backstabbing culture in the NHS. Any conversation seems to kind of head in the direction of eventually kind of moaning about someone, whether it be a relative or a manager or politicians or whoever. And it's very easy to get drawn into that. I mean, what binds people best other than a common enemy? And yet, I mean, it's, I think, unhealthy and breeds an unhealthy workplace environment, and it's not godly. It's not the way Jesus taught us to act. And it's hard. And I certainly don't pretend like I get this right, and I'm certainly guilty of moaning and moaning about my colleagues. But at the same time, it's, I think, being conscious that it's not the way that Jesus intended. It's interesting that you mentioned the kind of stuff in writing as well. I mean, the whole NHS is, I think, built around sort of trying to identify negative things and kind of ignoring all the positive, good work that happens. Yeah. I mean, in our end-of-year appraisals, generally when we get feedback from colleagues or from supervisors, there's often 3 options you can tick: no concerns, some concerns, or can't comment. And so the highest compliment you can get
is no concern.
That's the best that my supervisor can write about me.
We haven't noticed anything bad about you, but there probably is still there.
Exactly. And it's just nuts.
That's very good. Very good. Well, I happen to know one of the things that you do, which I was very impressed with, was being alert to when people go off shift. I hadn't realised that the dynamics of A&E people don't make complete sense. Everybody doesn't go off shift at the same time. So there's a staggering, and I think that, what you were saying about being aware of that and then saying thank you to people.
Well, yeah.
They're going off an hour before you or half an hour before you, but you make a point of engaging with them that way. I think that's, despite the pace of it, despite all that's. I was very impressed with that.
Yeah, I mean, I learned that from a consultant of mine who would always notice when I was about to go off shift and thank me for my hard work that day.
Right.
I have no idea how much of my work he noticed, but he thanked me for it. And I was like, actually, I can do that. I can do that with my nursing colleagues and with my junior colleagues as well. And I try, and I think it makes a difference. It made a difference to me.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the syndromes that happens in intensive care units is the juniors have spent the whole night sort of desperately struggling with all kinds of unexpected events, and at last you're just making it till about 7 o'clock when it's like the cavalry in the morning. The cavalry appear. You're absolutely exhausted, and the consultant appears and starts looking and see what's happened. And sadly, so often the consultant turns up and then starts criticizing and saying, "Oh, why didn't this happen? That blood glucose was late, and why did it? And I wasn't informed about this." And and just to have some positive encouragement, I thought you did really well. You've done, obviously, it's been a difficult shift, but well done. You've managed to keep all this under control, and nobody died. That's a
Yeah.
And so that kind of sort of positive reinforcement really makes all the difference.
Without going into the, if you like, the philosophy of medical ethics on this particular podcast today.
I can recommend another one.
Yes,
Where you can hear John speak about medical
Yes,
ethics.
John, for those who don't know, John Wyatt's written widely on medical ethics, and there are several books that you can consult on his opinions. But just about, these things come at you, don't they? They come at both of you, I assume, in A&E as well. So how do you deal with it when it's coming at you?
Well, one of the things I learned early on, and that is that ethical challenges are often unexpected. They come from left field, they come with no warning, and bang, you've got to respond. And there is just no time often to say, oh, this is clearly a big ethical, I need to go away and read some big books. I'll come back in 3 weeks' time and tell you what my decision is.
Phone a friend.
Yeah. So basically, you've got to do your ethical thinking in advance. You've got to say, what if, and that's what I've had to wrestle with myself, and what I try and help my friends and colleagues and juniors to do is think through in advance. How would you respond if X happens? Where are your red lines? And what's the reasons? How would you explain your ethical positions and so on? So, and yet they still, having said all that, the ethical problems do come completely from left field. And numerous times in my case, in fact, later on when I had sort of written about medical ethics, it almost felt like the Almighty said, well, you think you're a bit of an expert in medical ethics, just try this one. And I'm going, So it keeps you humble.
You never know. He's just developing you for your next book, the follow-up. It's like 7 habits. There's an 8th habit. 8 principles I didn't think of last time. That's by John Wyatt.
It just keeps you humble.
How's that recall, is it? So for you also, I mean, do you see moments within A&E where, if you like, the Christian ethical perspective has made a difference?
Yes. It's often tricky because, I mean, in any medical context, often you have very little time to think through your ethics. And then in A&E, where it's often kind of seconds to minutes of trying to make a decision. And I agree, I certainly have benefited hugely from being taught from basically the start of medical school, from the Christian Medical Fellowship, from John and others, about these sort of ethical things and how to think through them. And I think that's hugely important. I certainly, would have benefited hugely from that. But yeah, certainly issues around end of life often, and withdrawal of treatment, kind of CPR, DNA CPR, that kind of stuff.
I think you might have to say DNA CPR. Just tell me about it.
CPR is cardiopulmonary resuscitation, trying to restart someone's heart with chest compressions, electric shocks, drugs, and then DNA CPR is do not attempt resuscitation, so it's not attempting that. And certainly I've been privy to a few conversations where I've actually had, I felt the need to go, no, I think I disagree with this. I disagree with this decision based on this reason. So kind of an obvious example that I've encountered more than once is a decision to make someone not for resuscitation based on, quote, their quality of life. So their quality of life is not great because they're just sat bedbound watching television all day, and therefore we shouldn't attempt resuscitation. independent of whether we think resuscitation will work or not.
Right.
I am in favour of DNARs in the situations where we don't think it will work, and therefore we don't want to give a treatment that we know won't work. And, there's lots of circumstances where it is appropriate, very much so. But actually, when it comes to quality of life decisions, I have felt the need on a few occasions to go, who are we to say that someone's life is not worth living? Who am I to say that their quality of life is not good enough for us to try? I can say that a medication won't work. I have the right to do that, but I don't have the right to say that someone's life is not worth living. And I think that is a distinctly Christian, at least the way I see it is quite a distinctly Christian view that can influence decisions made, that we believe that our inherent value is not based on our functionality or our quality of life or how much we like our lives, but it's intrinsic to our creation.
So how have the colleagues responded when you've made that kind of point?
Well, it's interesting because, as you say, it's often very, you don't have the time to think through your ethics. And that applies to all colleagues, right?
Yeah.
And I think if you start to push back against an ethical issue, I think my experience is that most people go, oh yeah, I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah.
Like most people haven't thought about this kind of stuff.
Exactly.
And so generally they're receptive to it.
Yeah, that's my experience too. I think that a lot of medics they really only think in terms of technical, aspects, following protocols, and just sort of, and when you suddenly say, hang on a minute, is this the right thing to do? And it's suddenly, oh, wow, I hadn't thought about that. So I think that is part of our role as Christians and the people who are thinking about this, the bigger picture, that often we can, and other people say, actually, what? Now you've mentioned it, I think you're right. I think we should, So it's almost like being the canary in the the mine, isn't it? Just pointing out there are issues here we need to think about.
Thinking about sustaining oneself over many years, already quite a few years, and many years for you. What has helped you, if you like, stay on the straight and narrow, emotionally, physically, spiritually?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing to say is that I'm not the best role model because I, having worked in this very, very demanding situation for decades, more than 20 years, the level of pressure and stress was such that eventually I cracked up and had quite a severe psychiatric illness, necessitating a whole period in hospital of slow recovery and then planning my life and career. So I'm not necessarily the best role model, but I think what I have learned both before and after my breakdown is that friendship, human friendship, is probably the biggest single resource. And certainly when I did crack up, there's nothing like having a major psychiatric illness to discover who your real friends are. And I was very moved and touched by the love and the concern and just the support that I got from some really close friendships. So investing in your friendships, beforehand, before the break,
It's a bit late.
It's a bit late after. And so, creating the kind of depth and honesty and openness of friendships so that there are people who are there for you. One of the problems that Christian medics have is that there are quite a lot of support mechanisms within the NHS, including, various counselling services, psychotherapy,
yoga classes,
mindfulness. But the problem is that the kind of spiritual aspects of it get lost. But then when we go to our local church communities, most people in a Christian community, and you want to try and explain about this terrible shift you've had in the cardiac arrest that went wrong, and you're feeling terribly guilty and all the rest. I mean, people are just, they can't really cope with that.
Yeah.
And so really, it's almost like the only people who really cope are other Christians who are also medics, who are in the profession. And so there's a particular closeness and role for your colleagues who understand it. They share both the spiritual issues, but also the reality of what it's like to work in medicine.
But developing friendships is quite a difficult thing to do. Those kind of friendships you're talking about anyway. It's sort of like the average 40-year-old man has, a string of friends.
Well, this is interesting, isn't it? Because I think people often do have quite good friendships at kind of college, university period. And then often what happens over the following 10, 20 years is that our friendships just often seem to wither and disappear. So something I learned from Rico Tice, actually, he said, love is a 4-letter word spelt Time. And I think that is so profound and so important. In other words, the only way to develop these kind of really close, intimate friendships is to choose to spend time alone, to make it, quotes, quality time. And that means that we've got so many other distractions. We've got, all the things we need to do, catch up on my emails, catch up on the latest Netflix, and all the rest. And I need to say, actually, there's something that's even more important than this, and that is spending time with my closest friends.
Yeah, I think actually, and the millennial and the Gen Z generation are even worse when it comes to that, because most of our friendships, at least a huge part of them, are done via text and photos on WhatsApp or an Instagram or Snapchat or whatever. And yeah, I think there is something to be said of physical, human-to-human relationships that we are intentionally depriving ourselves of. It's not good for man to be alone. We're designed to be physically with people. And yet, so much of at least my life is conducted through the medium of photos and text.
It's essentially you say about the specialist question. In other words, here am I, a Christian, and you're a doctor, and so my question might be, how do I actually get myself to the point where I'm some use? My old prayer partner used to. He's a businessman, and then suddenly, as he grew. And got more and more responsibility, my ability to actually understand, what he was actually going through and the scale of the questions that he was wrestling with diminished, year by year by year. So, I have to carry on asking lots of questions. What do you say to people who actually really do want to support you, but if you, how do you get me to the point where I'm not flipped out by the cardiac arrest and somebody bleeding out in front of you while you're having your lunch? I do.
No, it's a good question. I think it's a two-way process, isn't it? I mean, I need to be honest with you without sharing all the gory details, but I need for you to try and help you to understand what it feels like in this kind of situation, and asking, just explain it to me, to explain what it feels like. I'm listening. How can I pray for you? It's, I think it's the heart, and it's a two-way process, isn't it? It's as we make ourselves vulnerable to one another that the intimacy grows. The amazing thing about John Stott, who was intentionally reaching out to younger people in order to develop this friendship, was that once he started to develop the friendship with you and he trusted you and was getting to know you, he was prepared to make himself remarkably vulnerable. He shared with me, we'd only been sort of knew one another for 2 or 3 years, and then to my astonishment, he started sharing some very deep and intimate stuff about his own struggles. And I was just taken aback by that level of integrity, vulnerability, honesty. And of course, it takes the friendship on to a deeper level. If you're prepared to take the initiative and actually talk about the real stuff, that's a way of building a deeper friendship. And actually, you don't need to understand all the technical details, do you? What you need to understand is the heart. What's and sometimes just asking, how is it with your heart? How is it with your soul? Is a good question.
It's a good question. Yeah. The question that was on the table, which you've given an answer to so far, is what sustained you through that. So one of those things is really good friendships, cultivating really good friendships as a kind of rule of life, as a kind of conference. Is there anything else that has gotten you through?
I think it's avoiding the traps. There are some real traps. One of the ways, because medics spend their whole time with drugs, we assume that pharmacological approaches is the best way of dealing with problems. And so it's very common for doctors to self-medicate themselves. Sometimes, with drugs, with tranquilizers, with antidepressants, with alcohol. I mean, doctors, the definition of alcoholic is someone who drinks more than their doctor. And, and it's not just a joke, A lot of medics drink a lot of alcohol because it's a kind of pharmacological approach. So sex and sexual promiscuity is, again, very common amongst junior doctors and nurses. I mean, and it's very easy when you're very tired and depressed and lonely, and here's an available person. So there are. It's trying to avoid the other means, which is so easy to fall into, and say, actually, the healthy way is friendship. And that's what I'm going. And I need my friends now because I'm feeling vulnerable.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think as well, our jobs are inherently stressful and inherently unpleasant. We deal with sickness that is unpleasant. And I certainly I found myself kind of going home and then instinctively looking at BBC News or social media and scrolling through all the unpleasant, horrible, ugly stuff that is out in the world as well, and kind of being conscious of that and the effect it's having on my mental health. I worked in one department where in the staff room of the A&E, there was constantly playing 24 hours in A&E for some bizarre, weird sort of self-punishment. And I was like, why would you do this to yourself? But yeah, so I think maybe avoiding that.
Downton Abbey or something.
Yeah, something escapism, like some Disney film or something.
Something positive I really learned was the idea of mental hygiene, so that we all know that physical hygiene is important and we have to wash our hands every day. And the fact that I washed my hands yesterday doesn't mean I'm going to have to wash my hands today. On a neonatal unit, you can end up washing your hands 60, 70, 80, 100 times in a day. But mental hygiene is also important. And mental hygiene is monitoring my thought life and then saying, I'm not going to dwell on that stuff. I'm not going to allow myself to go round and round this loop. And that list in Philippians where it says whatever things are true, whatever things are just, whatever things are righteous, whatever things are of good report. Think about these things. And apparently the Greek is stronger than think. It's sort of cogitate, reflect, meditate. And I think that discipline of just monitoring my thought life and then saying, I'm not going to allow this, I'm going to focus my mind on things. It's interesting, if you break down the Philippians list, it's things that are true, starts with truth, it's things that are good, and it's things that are beautiful. I'm going to fill my mind with things that are truth, things that are good, and things that are beautiful.
Hey, pretty good. You mentioned something a bit earlier when you talked about the role of the medic in medicine, but also there was a sense about the role of the medic in the church. And I just wonder whether you wanted to expand on that? Was that
Yeah, and I think, again, this is something that John has had a bit of an influence in my thinking as well, in that, yes, we're called, as you write about being a Christian influence in the workplace, but I do think there is something to be said about the role of medics in the church. Not to kind of overinflate our importance or to kind of think that we suddenly have all the answers, but I think there is roles to play for those who are willing to take them. When it comes to helping Christians or helping the church at large, think through things, whether it be sickness, death, mental health, science, technology, identity, and we come, as medics, we come into the church, and I suppose what we don't want to do is leave our medical brains at the door. I think that's John Stott who said that. And actually, we can be of use. we can be of use in certain things, and certainly being able to speak into, say, a friend's mental health struggles from a kind of friendship level, from a sort of Christian biblical level, but also from a medical level, and going, well, actually, maybe it sounds like it's worth seeing your GP and chatting through this, that, and the other. can be of immense value. And I do think that is something that I would encourage Christian medics to think about, the positive impact, what we can contribute to the church. And also at the same time, we go for a lot of other professions as well, whether it be like legal stuff or political stuff or whatever. Because we are, I think, much stronger if we bring our experience and our expertise into the church and use it as one body rather than, as I say, kind of leaving our brains at the door.
Yeah, there was a church, similar point really, a church that was reaching out to a particular neighbourhood close by them. And it was a sort of urban regeneration neighbourhood, and the church wasn't an urban regeneration church. And they came back and they were doing the report on all the things that they found and so on and so forth. And there was a woman in the room who was a GP who had a practice in that neighbourhood, and no one had asked her the question. And of course she knew hundreds of these, and because of the conditions that were coming into her surgery, she knew the level of mental health, she knew about physical things, she knew about malnutrition, she knew about all kinds of things, and no one had asked her. So there's also the kind of, we need to be asking proactively, you've got insights, just in your context.
I was chatting to a vicar friend of mine about some quite technical issue relating to gender and transgenderism and reassignment. And I kind of asked him for his view on what do you think the church should do? And he basically responded, to be honest, like, we're kind of waiting for the medic to tell us what to do. Mm. And I said, okay, great. Well, hang on, that's us.
Whoops.
Okay, now I gotta, certainly.
Fair enough.
I do think the GP, this is one of the great privileges of being a GP, and that is you are rooted into a local community. And in many ways, the GP has replaced the priest or the pastor as the person that people naturally turn to with their problems. And where I've seen it work really well is where a local church community is working very closely with a Christian GP in Christian GP practice. You get a very powerful combination because they can refer both ways. If someone goes to see the GP with what is basically a spiritual problem, they can be referred that way. If someone is seeing the church with what is basically a medical problem, so it's a very powerful combination. It's this kind of holistic, Christlike engagement in all aspects of humanity.
Come to you, Ben, now, because having polled 300,000 junior doctors with their questions of what they would like to ask John Wyatt, would you want to ask him one or more of the others, or just a question of your own?
Sure. I mean, how long do we have? I mean, I've got plenty.
One.
Just one.
And then perhaps one of your own.
Okay, sure. One of the kind of other common threads that came out when I was polling my WhatsApp groups, so a dozen of them, was, I suppose, kind of going back to the spiritual versus physical, and particularly conversations around futility of medical treatment and potentially end-of-life care. So one of the questions that someone asked me to ask you was, how do you balance your belief in the limits of medicine with your beliefs in supernatural intervention? And also, how does that work when the patient themselves believes in supernatural intervention and therefore doesn't want what we deem futile treatment to stop?
Yeah, this is a really important issue. And so one of the paradoxes is a number of studies have shown that people who are approaching death and who are religious believers or who use religious coping, it's often described as a way of coping with them, they're more likely to insist on futile treatment at the end of life. They're more likely to insist on being admitted to the intensive care unit. They're less likely to have a do not resuscitate order, and they're more likely to die badly in an intensive care unit. And I think one of the things that I've seen repeatedly over my medical career is that sometimes bad religion is worse than no religion at all. The bad religion, bad theology can do a huge amount of damage. And certainly one of the arguments that is used for by some believers is, I'm trusting God to heal me. I know I may have terminal cancer, but I'm absolutely convinced he's going to heal me. I'm having faith, but I've got to give God the very best chance of healing me, and that means I've got to be admitted to the intensive care unit. If I don't want to go to the intensive care unit, I don't have faith. So this kind of really I think, twisted kind of logic. If God was really going to heal you, he really doesn't need the intensive care unit. But so I think trying to help people, and this is one of the huge problems. I think, as doctors, we're not in a position to override. Often we have to work with patients, we have to work with parents as a pediatrician, and that means we listen to them, we understand them, but then we can try and persuade, to try and say, actually, I too am a believer, but my own understanding is that that's not a very helpful way of looking at it, and that dying well, helping to see that, it's a terrible way to die. You've seen it, I've seen it. I've watched people die in horrible ways, having cardiac massage, having drugs injected, electric shocks, cracking open tests. What a terrible way to die. And yet, sadly, it happens regularly in our hospitals. And it happens because people haven't got the courage to say enough is enough. And so helping people to see another way, but at the same time recognizing that sometimes, I'm not God. I sometimes get it wrong. And I just have to recognize that's the case. And also, God gives people a huge amount of responsibility for their own care, doesn't he? I mean, time and time again in the scriptures, it's almost as though God watches people make terribly bad decisions and then live out the consequences of those decisions. Why didn't he intervene and say, no, that's the bad thing? He doesn't. He almost respects us, even when we're making very bad decisions. And so sometimes you watch patients make terrible decisions, and sadly, you watch the consequences enact in front of your eyes.
And often it's actually relatives' decisions rather than the patients themselves, who are often not able to make the decisions.
Yes.
The conversation is entirely happening with a relative, which I find even harder, because it's like...
It is hard, and so often relatives are motivated by fear. And it's fear that drives them. Say, just do everything, doctor. Just keep it going. Do everything. And that's not a helpful response. It's an understandable response.
Yeah, it's interesting because often these conversations, I find, as soon as a patient or a relative brings religion into it, it's almost like a kind of brake slam on the conversation, and the doctors go, okay, better not talk about it anymore.
Yeah.
Then we'll just do it then, because this. Do you think that there is a role to say, well, actually, theologically speaking, here's maybe another...
Yeah, I do. I mean, obviously it takes sensitivity, but there's definitely a place to say, well, I too believe in God, and let me be honest about the way I see it. And I've done that on a number of occasions in these kind of conversations. Of course, you've got to be sensitive. But interestingly, the rules from the General Medical Council, they say actually discussing spiritual issues is important, and that done appropriately, doctors can share their own perspectives and beliefs. All that we mustn't do is we mustn't abuse, we mustn't coerce, we mustn't say, well, I'm a Christian and this is what you must do, God is telling you. Of course we mustn't do that.
Yeah.
But appropriately sharing our own perspectives. And I've, again, on many occasions, people are quite shocked. They don't expect the doctor to start talking about God, but the fact that they like the fact that the doctor, even if they're coming from a different faith tradition completely, like a Muslim, I often find I can have a much better conversation because they know I'm a believer, and therefore I don't think they're completely mad, and I'm respecting their beliefs, but I'm just saying, can you think about it this way?
Yeah, and actually, in palliative care, I mean, often the pro formers say ask about spiritual stuff, and we I think we're quite good at in the end of life setting, asking, do you have a faith and do you want referral to the chaplaincy? So I can imagine it's not that much of a step to start actually talking about it too.
Yeah. What about one question you'd like to ask John?
You know what's coming.
I do know. I like the questions.
We were brainstorming questions. I suppose one question I've never asked you before, and I'm curious about your answer, is obviously you retired from clinical practice a few years ago. If you had your clinical career again, is there anything you'd do different?
I'd certainly do pediatrics and neonatology again. I would I would be much more careful in monitoring my mental health, and I think I would be more assertive, because one of the strange things that happened is that basically what the reason I cracked up was that the overload of work, both academic and clinical work, was just completely overwhelming, and it seemed there was no way out. Everything was hopeless. I couldn't see any way out with honour. When I did eventually crack up, this caused quite a bit of a stir, because I was the professor and what on earth was happening. And so the university and the hospital both created new full-time consultant posts. They said, oh dear, this is very good. And so they created a full-time new academic post and a full-time consultant neonatology post, new posts. And the sad thing is, the money was there. They could have done it beforehand, and it would have made a huge difference. But and if I had been more assertive about, in a gentle and godly way, but I think it would have been possible for me to say, this is not sustainable, and to push back. But instead, I just felt this God had called me to do this. I just had to somehow survive. So, yeah, I wish I had done that. And yet, the interesting thing is that going through this extremely painful process of a severe psychiatric illness, of a locked hospital ward, of everything that flowed from that, it changed me as a person. But actually, I can see a lot of good and positive things that have flown out of that terrible experience. And if you could offer me the possibility of going back and just wiping out that experience, I wouldn't take it, because out of that, it was a kind of redemptive experience. God loves to take terrible, destructive, painful things and somehow miraculously, gradually turn them into blessing and healing. And that's my testimony. He's done that in my life.
Amen. What a beautiful way to begin, to remind ourselves of who Jesus is, what he come to do, and what he has done, not only in drawing each one of us to himself, but week by week, year by year, in our very lives. Thank you so much, Benjamin Chang and Jonathan Wyatt, for your insights, for your vulnerability, transparency, and energy, and indeed for your work day by day, shift by shift, and over the years in bringing healing and wisdom both to your patients and into the church. Hugely grateful. Just to fulfill all righteousness, it's quite a privilege to be sitting with two authors in the room at the same time. And this, for those of you who are not familiar with, is Christ and the Culture Wars, Speaking for Jesus in a World of Identity Politics by Ben Chang. And I can commend this book to you. In fact, I have commended this book.
In writing.
And it's on the inside. So it's terrific piece of work. And John, some of you know, has written much in many areas, but his new book coming out is very pertinent to what you've been talking about today, which is called Transforming Friendship. Transforming Friendship. Lessons indeed from John Stott, and I imagine other people. And of course, John has been a very good friend to many people himself. So thank you very much indeed to you both. If you're interested in things particularly medical, do scuttle over to the Christian Medical Fellowship website. It is really an outstanding resource, and you'll find many things written there by John and many others, both if you like practically as well as theologically. So that's Christian Medical Fellowship, CMF. And if more generally you're interested in things about work, then there's no better place to go than the LICC website. Well, there are other places, but ours is terrific too. So scuttle over there, have a look. Books, links, films, videos, events, and so on. Please do. We've been encouraged in the melee of life to pray continually. So I do pray for you that indeed in whatever you do, you might grow, as John has encouraged us to do, in your awareness of the Lord's presence with you, so that whether you're examining an abdomen or examining a spreadsheet, you might be able to do it with him, in him, and for him. Thanks very much indeed for listening. Shalom, shalom.